Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, distinguished professor at Rutgers University Law School and author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. You can follow me on social media at Sahar Aziz Law and learn more about my work at saharazizlaw.com. I also serve as the executive director of the Rutgers Law School Center for Security, Race and Rights, also known as CSRR. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on law and policy that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To learn more about CSRR's work, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and follow us on social media at Rutgers CSRR and at RUCSRR. If you find the Race and Rights Podcast informative, please consider making a donation by going to csrr.rutgers.edu and pressing the donate button. And please give generously. In today's episode, I speak with Professor Brittany Friedman at the University of Southern California. She is the author of the critically acclaimed book, Carceral Apartheid: How Lies and White Supremacists Run Our Prisons, published in January of 2025. Professor Friedman argues that prisons are a microcosm of carceral apartheid that operates as a larger governing strategy to decimate political targets and foster deceit, disinformation, and division in society. She explains how beginning in the 1950s, California prison officials declared war on imprisoned Black people and sought to identify Black militants as a key problem, thereby creating a strategy for the management, segregation, and elimination of these individuals from the prison population that continues until the present day. As a result, white supremacy within the institutional conditions in U.S. prisons produces a power dynamic of racist intent in the prison system that culminates in Professor Brittany Friedman terms carceral apartheid. Let's hear what our guest has to say about a topic that has imprisoned millions of Black people in the U.S. and legitimizes genocide and torture abroad. Welcome, Professor Friedman, to the Race and Rights Podcast. It's a pleasure to be here today with you to discuss your new book, Carceral Apartheid: How Lies and White Supremacists Run Our Prisons. So I wanted to start our conversation today by asking you, when did you begin writing Carceral Apartheid, and what was the impetus for writing this book?
So thank you so much for having me. It is a joy to be here. I feel like it's a reunion for us. And so I'm just really excited to talk to you about this because this book has been a long time coming. I started working on it over a decade ago. I was a graduate student and I was just very unsatisfied with what was being put forth in the official law enforcement narrative about Black liberation movements in the United States and movements that have really been influential in uniting the struggle for freedom across the prison and societal boundary. And I could sense what I was reading was very biased. It didn't smell right. And I followed my gut and I'm like, this is all written by former police wardens and sergeants who have a particular political incentive to frame groups in a particular way, because that's where they get their funding, is based on keeping us safe from certain political enemies. And so it is in their best interest to write history in this way. And so I was like, I need to investigate. And one of my favorite things to do is to investigate up. And so I'm like, I need to investigate the prison system itself and try to understand, how did they come to criminalize groups such as the Black guerrilla family, which I came to argue in my book. It's the prison arm of the Black Panther Party and the Black liberation movement. On the outside, how did they come to criminalize them as a prison gang? What's the role of the Aryan Brotherhood? Why are they showing up in every major murder of a BGF member? Why are officials allowing correctional officers to only shoot at BGF members and Aryan Brotherhood members are surviving? So it's like, I need to figure out what's going on. And what I ended up finding is that, prison officials were allowing corrupt correctional officers to use the AB and what would become the Aryan Brotherhood, basically for a proxy war to take out freedom fighters that were fighting within prisons for Black liberation and that were connecting their movement to the Black Liberation Army, to the Black Panther Party, and also they connected their movement abroad. So they very explicitly articulated in their writings and in their interviews with me, because I did original interviews with the co-founders of the Black Guerrilla family. And, they articulated, they're like, while we were incarcerated, Mandela was incarcerated. And that's how we saw ourselves. We knew that we were fighting a global movement against settler colonialism here in the US, but also abroad. And that's why we were targeted. So they're very clear on what was going on. And I think it inspired me to dig deeper. And that's kind of how the journey of what I call unearthing began, unearthing these state narratives.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the time frame that you were talking about? Because there may be many people who haven't even heard of these groups, because you draw on years of history examining the deeply flawed U.S. incarceration system. But before we kind of talk about that history, tell us more about the backdrop under which the carceral system was effectively engaging in a racial war using the Aryan Brotherhoods as a proxy.
Yes, absolutely. And, the way that I think of it in my historical work is showing very clearly that white supremacy is fundamental to the origins of prisons, because white supremacy undergirds the birth of the colonial expansion that created America. And it's the bedrock of why our nation originated as one of violence through containment and detention. And so I show, for example, that the chief surgeon of San Quentin, who was the chief surgeon from about 1913 until 1951, I do original historiography on him because he's pretty much he's truly understudied, right? I'm not overusing that term. He's truly missing from a lot of the records of his influence. And he was a eugenicist. He was drawing from previous scientists and current scientists of his time on how do you reprogram someone and readjust them to fix them, to mold them into a docile human being. And how do you, do that biologically and socially? And so I show, using his memoir, I actually think that the book I have is haunted because I ended up with a first edition signed copy by him of his memoir. And I don't even touch that book anymore because if I would touch it, I feel like my hand would start hurting. So I pull from that heavily and show in his own words how he describes performing over 10,000 experiments on over 10,000 incarcerated men in the California system during his tenure as chief surgeon, trying to fix them and readjust them, much like other scientists were doing to indigenous people in boarding schools, to people that are housed in public hospitals and asylums. And so he's creating this, house of horrors, if you will. And then he's also bringing in knowledge from social science on how do you readjust the mind, not just the body. And I start with him to show how what I'm terming as carceral apartheid really is this, it's not just prisons, it's this larger governing strategy of decimation and division that is trying to create racial difference violently and then police through these varying means this system of difference and division. And so I show this. He's the example I use for official tools. What are the official legal tools of our society that are designed to promote carceral apartheid as governance? And he's the best example because he had such a significant influence on correctional policy, and not just corrections. He influenced penal policy broadly, when we're talking about detention and containment. And he also changed history in the sense that, many people don't know that his research and torture and experimentation on incarcerated people for all those years led to the creation of Viagra. Most people don't realize that. It's because one of his main arguments was that incarcerated men who are, a significant population are men of color. And there's all these horrific photographs of like men of African descent, indigenous descent, Asian descent, who at the time were being rounded up in California for incarceration well before like the 80s, like they were being rounded up because of all of the Exclusion Act, like all these reasons. And those were his test subjects. And he would inject animal parts from animal testes and different things into their genitals, into other parts of their body, claiming that he was fixing their masculinity. And one of the quotes I quote in my book from his memoir is like, there's a decline in like the power of white male masculinity. And it's his job to fix it by treating the incarcerated who are men at their worst. And that's the actual title of his memoir, is Men at Their Worst. So it's why for me, my book it is about prisons, but it's showing that prisons are just the perfect case study to understand and articulate what I'm talking about as the true way that our country is run.
What time frame are we talking about here?
So this particular surgeon, his name is Leo Stanley, and he was the chief surgeon from 1913 to 1951 in San Quentin. And what's interesting is once he retired, then, my book moves in that particular that chapter, and I call that chapter Adjusting Problem Inmates, because that's what the department explicitly said they were doing. So once he retires, 2 years later in 1953, prison officials in Sacramento are like, okay, we've lost our beloved Leo Stanley. So we need to create a committee on the intensive treatment of problem cases. That's what they called it. And as I show in that chapter, again, doing original archival work, that they decided they were going to create adjustment units or adjustment centers within California prisons. And these adjustment units originally claimed they were going to be readjusting using Stanley's methods and others that they started to bring in as staff, readjusting psychotic cases. That's what they called it. But as I show in my work, only about, it was 5 years after they were organized and created. In 1958, they put out a bulletin that was, I'm paraphrasing, but it's like disciplinary procedures for the Nation of Islam. And as I show in that chapter, very quickly, their argument about who's a problem case went from people that were labeled as psychotic to people that were Muslim, that were Black, and that were seen as behavioral problems because the department claimed that their political beliefs were a risk and a security threat, that they were not really a religion and that they were a cult. And that's what they were arguing explicitly in their writings. And I was able to dig this up because I found in the archive these like essentially COINTELPRO style investigations that then ensued in the late 50s and early 60s into the Nation of Islam and its members who were in California prisons, very similar to what Hoover was doing on the outside was happening in California. And then people were being disappeared into these adjustment units that have this legacy of Leo Stanley, but now they're institutionalized as these solitary confinement units being tortured for years. And I really wanted to center this as the start of my book because adjustment centers have been very prevalent in the writings of imprisoned Black revolutionaries for decades. Like they're writing about their time in the adjustment center. I'm like, what is this adjustment center? And then I realized there's not a lot of scholarship, and I'm checking with historians and they're like, yeah, there's not a lot of original scholarship on adjustment centers. Like we just don't have the data. And so that's when I started digging and I was like, no, there is data. It's somewhere. And I found it in the state archive. There was a collection written by prison officials themselves, documenting why they created the centers, the policies, and who's targeted and why. And then all of these, they had basically folders for people, and it would follow them when they got out. So once you get out, like that information is going to local police. It's going to probation and parole. So I'm showing how, there's this network of surveillance that is following people that's starting in prison. In 1961, they expanded the threat category. So it was no longer Nation of Islam. It was what they were terming as Black militants broadly. So anybody who was even suspected of any sort of sympathy to the civil rights movement or the Black freedom movement, you could be rounded up and targeted for placement in these special adjustment units. And something's very small, like if you had the wrong book, it's very similar to today. It's the same thing happens in prisons currently in California. And my book is showing where does that come from? Like currently in California, if you have the wrong book, you will be sent to solitary. And that history comes from this time period that I'm tracing in the book.
Wow, this is remarkable. As you were talking, I was thinking about the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X specifically, and how he had actually been imprisoned, right, from 1946 to 1952. Now, I believe that was in Charleston, South Carolina. To what extent do we have evidence that what you researched in California had started to spread to other states? Because, I mean, the historians now have shown how the Nation of Islam in particular and other, as you stated Black, so-called quote unquote Black militants were considered enemies of the state. And in fact, I talk about this in my book, The Racial Muslim, where if you are a dissident and you are religious, you are the most targeted by the state. And if you're Black, right, it's all intersectional, and each of these identities makes you more and more of a perceived threat to the state, and also, as a result, surveilled, policed, and so on and so forth. Do you have a sense of how that has spread across the country, or has it been limited to California, starting, back in before the 1950s and then until today?
So, I love this question because the influence of California on nationwide correctional practices is significant. And I was able to find in these investigative folders that were housing the prison official investigations letters from wardens of other state correctional systems writing and saying explicitly, what do you do with these people? And they were talking about Black people, Muslims, people who, as I said, they might have the wrong speech or book or even a newspaper. If you had a Black newspaper, that could send you to the adjustment units, which are, isolation units from hell, because you're not just in solitary, you're getting treated by a team of doctors who are pulling you out and doing whatever they want and claiming that it's fixing you. And it's fixing your problem when your behavioral problem are your political beliefs or your religion. And so we see, so many parallels to that is the colonial project. And that's why the Black leaders who eventually became leaders, right, of the Black population, so people who survive this, they become respected and become leaders and instituted mandatory political education for the Black population. So that's what was interesting, especially in San Quentin. If you wanted to be a part of what they were building, you had to go through a series of initiations and read like over 100 books. It was like this entire, training and process. And I interviewed people who were influential in creating that education curriculum. And the goal was so that people didn't see themselves as just being individually targeted. They wanted to one, help provide healing. So it's like if you see that it's not just you, and you see that, wow, this is happening to me here in San Quentin, but this is also happening to freedom fighters in Kenya. This is happening to freedom fighters in South Africa. They were explicit in their support for Palestinian liberation. And that was also key, very explicit. And so like all of these uniting factors are why for me, like when I'm writing, I was like, this is carceral apartheid. And what do I mean by that? I'm like, well, I need to show how, yes, it is a system of sowing racial division and ethnic division, but how? Like explicitly how? And my argument is that it's doing so through these official means of physical and mental degradation that I've outlined, through official policies of separation and labeling, and then confining people in containment units. But the one of the biggest arguments of the book is that the governments know that that's insufficient. It's not enough to destroy the spirit and contain people. And so they have allowed and even encouraged extra legal means. And what I mean by extra legal means are, for example, I give several cases in my book of the same people who are surviving the adjustment units. If they are able to get released from the units, because you're given an indeterminate sentence, which means you have to like perform before a board to try to get out. So if they're able to get out and go back to the general population, then they become public enemy number one for these extra legal methods. And the main method was that correctional officers would use Nazis and set them up in fights with Nazis so that when they shoot, they can shoot at. So, and they describe themselves also as Black militants, so at Black militants. And there's several cases of this in my book. I show this through the archival record and then interviewing people who either knew the people who I found in the archive that were murdered or gaining access to letters that people wrote at the time saying like, my comrade was murdered by this officer and he set him up to fight with the Nazis. And so I trace this to, this is not just happening in prisons. We know that on the outside, law enforcement at the federal and at the state level and local levels, they also engage in these extra legal practices to take out political targets by setting people up to die at the hands of the Klan, by disappearing people, by spreading rumors and claiming someone's a snitch so that they can be attacked. And I show the same thing. It was happening in prisons from the time period I show is from the 50s. And then I go all the way up to the present to try to make the point that it's still happening in California, because one of the main people his life and death situate the book. It's because he was a co-founder of the Black Guerrilla family and his name is Hugo Pinnell. And he goes in the 60s and he's surviving all of these things I'm describing. And I was able to interview members of his family because he was murdered in 2015. By the members of the Aryan Brotherhood, and his family actually sued in a wrongful death suit that was unfortunately dismissed, but they sued because of the history of these setups against his friends that had died in previous decades. And they were like, this is not a coincidence. He was released. He was immediately in a fight with the AB and murdered. That is their routine tactic anytime they want to take someone out. And he had been in solitary for over 40 years. They siphoned him into solitary. I think he went into in like 1971 and he had been there and they let him out in Gen Pop for just a little bit. Like that's what was suspicious. It's like you let him out and then immediately he was taken out in that way. And so I lead and end with his life and his murder because it's just so exemplary of what I'm talking about. And he wrote so many letters, like there's just so much in his own voice.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how people got set up? For those of us who are unfamiliar with this, and not only the environment in prison, but how do wardens or guards set up people to get killed? What are some of the scenarios that are common?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the most influential incidents that I describe in the book, and I'll use that example because it shows the pattern I'm describing. So it happens in 1970 in Soledad. And so it is an example that some people in the public, like especially people of a certain generation, like when they read my book, they're like, I remember that. It was national news because that incident became national news because of what happened after. But in 1970, 3 men who were very influential in the Black militant movement that was growing. And it was growing in part because of the repression they were facing. So it was like this dialectic, right? They're becoming more and more organized because, in the words of someone I interviewed, who was a co-founder of what became the organization, he was like, we had to set up an official structure for ourselves because we were getting attacked and murdered by the administration. So if we didn't, we were like, we're just going to die anyway. Like, we have to organize ourselves. And that's how they ended up, having a very set, like, military type of structure. But it was like, because they were countering the warfare of the Department of Corrections. And they're like, that's the only way we're going to make it. And this incident was one of the precipitating events that convinced them that we have to live free or die trying. And that's why I give one of my, the sections in my book is titled that, in honor of that moment. And so in 1970 in Soledad, there were 3 men who were a member of the Black militant movement that was growing. One of them, he was a profound speaker and organizer. He was considered a leader because he had the ability to unite people across race and not just within the Black population. And one of the things that he did that was so profound is that he was able to get people across race to sign a petition naming all of the human rights violations that officers had engaged in, not just against the Black population, but against everybody, and like got people to sign it. And that made him like the number one enemy of the officers. And so not too soon after he was able to do that, that's when he was murdered in this setup. And so they put him and the other 2 men on the yard with members of what would become the Mexican Mafia and the Aryan Brotherhood, because they're aligned in California. And I show in my book, like, historically, their alliance has just been a very strategic one. And I show that, like, in tracing the history. But so they put them on the yard. They start fighting immediately. Like, as one person says, like, in the record, he's like, the white boys charged them. Like, so they charged them. They're fighting. And the Aryan Brotherhood has weapons because they're being armed by officers. And that's also something that came up in my interviews a lot. People described like being in these fights and then the Aryan Brotherhood having like a real knife, not like a little shank. And so they're armed and they're fighting. And then this corrupt white correctional officer, he takes his gun and he starts firing. And all of the witnesses are like, all of the Black witnesses, I'll be clear, all of the Black witnesses are like, he shot at them directly. He claimed that he was shooting toward the ground to get them to stop fighting, but they're like, no, he squared up, aimed, and like shot to the chest and was like, like shot them down. And that sparked off, like, that's why, historically, if you look up like the Soledad incident, it made nationwide news because there was a grand jury. And once the grand jury said that the officer, like, there's not going to be any charges against the officer who did this, there was a little riot in the prison and a white correctional officer was killed. And that's how you end up with, really in George Jackson, in his writings and in this moment, he's one of the accused of the murder. And he's a co-founder of the Black guerrilla family. And it becomes this like global moment. And I do talk about it in my book, but there's been so much written on it, and even in his own voice. But I do talk about it, and I talk about mainly from the point of view of founders of the Black guerrilla family that are still living and out, right, that were there. And they say, they're like, that moment when they were shot down, like that was the moment where we realized that we can't just be in these little Black militant cliques anymore. Like, you can't just be Nation of Islam and I'm Us Foundation, I'm a Panther. Like, we have to be one group. And that is where the Black guerrilla family comes from. They consolidate themselves in 1970. They actually do so in San Quentin because the Department of Corrections thought that it made sense to transfer many members of the clique to San Quentin. So they're all in one place. And the ones that were already in San Quentin are like, okay, welcome, of course. So it becomes this moment where they're like this, they realize like this was our moment. That's in his words. He's like, that was our moment. We're all here and we have to become one group. And it doesn't mean you're no longer in the Nation of Islam or you're no longer a Panther. But in prison, we are BGF.
Taking us to the contemporary moment, let's say the last 20 years or even 30 years. I mean, we know that you have 1980s is the war on crime, and 1990s is also the war on crime and the war on drugs. And then you start to see more attention paid, rightfully so, to the problem of mass incarceration. So how does your analysis inform starting from the 1980s onto today? And relatedly, how is it similar or different than the quote unquote mass incarceration studies?
Mm-hmm. So I think that my answer is an answer to both questions in the sense of, the reason why California was able to get so much money to fund the prison boom is because California was claiming that its prisons were too dangerous. And the Black guerrilla family became one of the main arguing points for more funding to build and expand more prisons. And as officers are setting people up in these fights, it leads to a huge war. Basically, like, this is why I don't call it this in the book, but it's something new I've been working on, is like a theory of proxy war for prisons, because I'm showing the role of these intermediaries, of how the AB they're the hitmen for the Department of Corrections, for the corrupt officers. So they are stowing and stirring up intentionally the very violence that then prison officials are going to Sacramento arguing in front of the legislature saying, see, and they would say things like they're like animals. They're fighting. Look, they're killing each other. They're murdering each other. We need to build a supermax. Look at the BGF. They would say they're threatening officers. We had that officer die in Soledad. We know they did it. That's what they would say. We know they did it. Even though, if you actually look at the case record, it's complicated. So they're arguing and they're saying, we know they did it. We know it wasn't an accident. We know that they are the source of the violence, but that isn't true. So as my book shows, it's like, that's not true. The original source of the violence are corrupt correctional officers and wardens, and prison officials were looking the other way because it was in their best interest, because the people that are getting set up in this way are people that they already have files on, people that they have been isolating in segregation units for years. And so it is not in their interest to step in and be like, okay, officers, you can't do that anymore. Like, that's not a valid policy or a tool of control. It's like, we didn't see them. We didn't see it, right? So in terms of California's prison expansion, I argue that this has been largely overlooked as a driver of getting the funds necessary. It's like manufacturing the violence, manufacturing the enemies, and then asking for more money so that you can contain them. This is a tried and true, how long is this strategy? It's as old as human beings have been creating civilizations, that political strategy. And explicitly, with California's most, I would say, draconian prison is Pelican Bay, the Supermax, where you're confined for about 22 and a half hours to 23 hours a day. So explicitly, the funding that was used to create that prison, the Supermax, which became a model nationally, actually. So it's another key point of California influencing national prison policy. The argument was explicitly about the BGF, explicitly, that we needed to contain people like them. And the reason I end with the contemporary and what's been happening at Pelican Bay for the last about 10 years is because it shows that the end goal for the Department of Corrections wasn't just to contain Black militants and to squash protests. They eventually ended up sending leaders of the AB, Mexican mafia. They end up there too later. They end up there. And that becomes, this moment for cross-racial mobilization that starts happening in the 2010s, where the leaders are all sitting there together, and the Center for Constitutional Rights, they did some amazing work on this and worked on the case actually as well, but amazing work making it public, and actually recorded their interviews with leaders in their own words, explaining basically my political consciousness happened because I'm sitting here in my cell in this isolation unit next to members of all these groups that we've been killing each other for decades. And they wrote this amazing statement called the Agreement to End Hostilities, where all of these leaders signed it, and they name directly the Department of Corrections and say, we will no longer allow you to pit us against each other for your own ends. And they ordered all of their members to stop fighting. It was like a peace accord. They were like, we're not fighting. They want us to fight. It's very clear. And it was so powerful. And since that happened, there's just been, things like gladiator fights happening where officers are setting people up. And it's because they're trying to stow up the violence again because it's useful to them.
Wow, that's remarkable. So when you chose the subject or the title of your book, I don't know if you were intentional or in terms of using the term apartheid and, to what extent you've received pushback, because that's a highly sensitive term for various reasons, depending on the context. I mean, some people will say, oh, you can't compare apartheid that we usually associate with South Africa with conditions that we think are not nearly as severe or comparable. Others will associate the term apartheid with what Israel is doing to the Palestinians, and that has created all sorts of political repression against people who argue that Israel is an apartheid state. So can you tell us a little bit more about why you named the book Carceral Apartheid and why you think apartheid, as opposed to mass incarceration or some other terminology, accurately describes what you're arguing in the book?
Absolutely. So, mass incarceration, it doesn't accurately describe it because we wouldn't have mass incarceration without carceral apartheid as a governing strategy. If there wasn't the impetus to contain, to label populations as undesirable and in need of eradication and removal into prisons and jails and into containment camps, which is what Black militants called them themselves, right? Then we wouldn't have mass incarceration. Mass incarceration is a political manifestation of this revving up in backlash to the gains of the Black freedom movement. But it's not a mass incarceration. The problem with it is that it can potentially, for those that are not, really well versed in it, it can limit the thinking to just that particular point in time, whereas carceral apartheid is an explicit goal to link in the unifying force that happens in settler colonial states and what it means in terms of developing a penal system that really is they're the containment units, the violent containment units that are created for that purpose of expansion. So the funny thing is I've never gotten pushback from anybody who was Black. I've never gotten pushback from anyone who was Native. No one who, no one who has been subjected or who has ancestors who have run from the Klan, who've run from the police, like nobody, everyone's like, absolutely 100%. That's why we see ourselves collectively as being a part of a larger global movement of oppressed peoples that have been surviving settler colonial states. And I think that there is a movement amongst, I would argue, I think it's a white supremacist movement in scholarship to dissuade people from using the term apartheid to describe the US. And it's because they're trying to whitewash history. And if for me, I prioritize the history and voices of people that are Black revolutionaries and freedom fighters. And in doing that, it's like undeniable. Like the evidence is undeniable. It's why I also thought that the archival record was so important, so that I have these varying sources. Because another thing I've gotten is people said, well, how can you just believe like they have their own political intentions too in their interviews? And I'm like, well, that's why as a historical sociologist, I triangulate. So I'm interviewing people who are on all sides of the battle, right? I interviewed people who were white supremacists during their incarceration, like covered in swastikas. And I have a whole chapter that's just called White Above All. Like, what is the point of view of someone who is a hitman for the state? What is that like, right? I do that because, again, it shows so many parallels to other settler colonial states, right? In Israel, in South Africa, you also have this proxy war happening where you have the state mobilizing white civilians who go into neighborhoods and take the law into their own hands. And I argue that, and I show that's what law enforcement and white civilians have been doing to Black communities since the inception of America. As soon as anyone was able to be free, that's what was happening. To reclaim and re-enslave people. And the same. So I do that to situate, like, corrupt correctional officers, they're not inventing this playbook. Like, prisons are porous institutions, and they are bringing with them skills and know-how that they learned on the outside. Because also in California, when they were recruiting officers and there was a big uptick in recruitment in the 50s and 60s, they were getting officers from rural areas in the West and also in the South. So it's like they know exactly what they're doing with these setups. They know exactly what they're doing in seeing the Aryan Brotherhood as an ally. And I do that to make this bigger argument so that way, no one can say like, this is a book like just about mass incarceration. It's like, no, I'm using this example to make a bigger point.
Well, thank you, Professor Friedman. That was thought-provoking and certainly validates why your book is so important in the broader conversation about race and criminal justice and white supremacy and social justice. And for listeners who haven't yet bought the book, you absolutely should. Carceral Apartheid, How Lies and White Supremacists Run Our Prison Systems by Professor Brittany Friedman, which was published in January of 2025. So thank you again. It was a pleasure talking with you, and I look forward to learning more about your future scholarship and keeping up with the reforms that I hope arise out of the important research that you do.
Thank you so much.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights Podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights Podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.